Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. This week we're going to peek behind the curtain of Temecula's political scene, where things aren't always what they seem.
Oh, I like that peek behind the curtain. Very appropriate.
Well, today's subject is the One Temecula Valley PAC, or One PAC for short.
Catchy.
You might recognize their slogan, "Make Temecula Boring Again."
Oh, yeah.
But the question is, what's really going on with this group, right?
Right.
We're diving deep into some pretty interesting documents that suggest a potential gap between One PAC's public image and their internal actions.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and this gap is particularly noticeable when it comes to their support for marginalized communities.
Okay, so One PAC's all about inclusivity on the surface, but some argue that their actions don't really line up with that.
Exactly. And to really understand this, we need to talk about Jeff PAC.
Okay.
He was a really key figure in One PAC.
Got it.
And in some of these documents, PAC expresses concerns that openly supporting LGBTQ plus rights could actually hurt their candidates' chances of winning elections.
So it's like he's putting electability ahead of actually advocating for these communities.
Right. And I imagine that's got to be pretty frustrating for supporters who bought into that message of inclusivity only to find this disconnect.
Yeah, it makes you question their true commitment. Like, are they genuine? Or is it all just for show?
Right. And that's a question we hear a lot when we look into groups like One PAC. Were they genuine in their allyship? Or was it more about appearances and winning elections?
And that's where it gets really interesting. Because PAC's claims about the supposed dangers of supporting LGBTQ plus rights, they weren't really based on any solid evidence.
You mean like actual data?
Exactly, like community engagement or polling data.
It was more like assumptions and anecdotes.
Yeah, and they never really tried to test those assumptions.
Meaning?
Meaning they didn't run any candidates who openly championed LGBTQ plus rights, and they didn't do any polling to gauge public opinion.
So it's like they created this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They assume that LGBTQ plus advocacy is a political suicide, so they avoid it altogether. And by doing that, they never actually challenge their own assumptions.
Precisely. And in the process, they might have even ended up reinforcing the very biases they claim to be fighting against.
So by playing it safe, they might have missed a chance to create real change.
And that leads to these accusations of performative allyship, appearing to support a cause publicly without taking any real concrete action.
And the documents really show this win-at-all-costs mentality. There's actually an email where they suggest to potential candidates that they shouldn't run if it means risking a more conservative candidate winning.
Wow. It seems like the focus was more on political strategy and winning the game than actually supporting those marginalized communities.
So maybe they were more focused on the game of politics than actually making a difference. And that's a tough pill to swallow for those who believed in their message.
Absolutely. It leaves people wondering, was it about genuine change or was it just about winning?
And that's a question a lot of people in Temecula are grappling with. But we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to this story.
There's a whole web of Temecula politics that we need to unravel. Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone.
In part one, we started to uncover the story of One PAC and their approach to being inclusive, right?
Yeah, how this group, the ones who said they were champions for those marginalized communities, they might have actually been more focused on political strategy than real change.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on how this played out, especially regarding LGBTQ plus issues here in Temecula.
Sounds good. One of the things that really jumps out from these documents is how One PAC kind of framed LGBTQ plus advocacy as a liability.
Yeah, it was like they thought that being open about supporting LGBTQ plus rights was going to scare off conservative voters.
Right, like it would just completely ruin their chances of winning any election.
So they were basing decisions on what they thought people believed instead of actually trying to get a read on the community's views.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really, I think that's a really good example of how fear and assumptions can drive these political decisions.
And sometimes that leads to unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
It makes you wonder, like, what if they'd actually gone and talked to the LGBTQ plus community,
Right.
What if they had sat down and had those difficult conversations, challenged their own assumptions?
It's totally possible that things might have gone in a completely different direction.
Instead, they just took the easy way out.
The path of least resistance, as they say, which unfortunately doesn't always lead to progress.
No, not at all. And it really plays into that whole idea of performative allyship that we were talking about.
Right, like saying you're all for a cause, but only when it's convenient, when it makes political sense.
True allyship, it takes a lot more than just avoiding controversy.
Yeah, it takes guts. You got to be willing to challenge the way things are.
You got to stand up for what's right, even when it's not popular. And speaking of playing it safe, remember that email where they're telling potential candidates to drop out if it means a more conservative candidate might win?
Oh, yeah. And there's another one where Jeff Pack actually admits that the best candidate isn't always the one most likely to win.
He straight up says that electability was their main concern when picking candidates.
Wow. So it really seems like winning was everything to them, even if it meant compromising what they stood for.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Like, you can end up sacrificing the very principles you're supposed to be upholding. It makes you wonder, what are you willing to give up just to win?
And think about the voters who were supporting One PAC, Did they have any clue about all these behind-the-scenes calculations?
Did they know that strategy was sometimes more important than finding the absolute best candidate?
That's such a big question. And it gets to the heart of what it means to be a truly representative group.
If you're making decisions based on winning instead of what's right, are you really representing the people who put their trust in you? It feels like there's always this tension in politics between being practical and sticking to your ideals.
Always.
You want to win elections so you can make a difference, but you also don't want to compromise your beliefs to the point where winning doesn't even matter anymore.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. And it looks like One PAC really struggled with that. But beyond that, we need to look at how these choices affected the people in Temecula, especially those who felt pushed to the sidelines.
Let's bring it back to the everyday folks.
Yeah.
How did all of this actually impact them?
Okay, so One PAC, they gained some power, but the way they did it had consequences for the whole community.
Especially those who already felt like outsiders.
Exactly. I'm talking about those LGBTQ plus individuals and families in Temecula.
The ones who felt let down because One PAC never really spoke up for them.
Yeah, they felt like One PAC was more worried about pleasing conservative voters than sticking up for their rights. And that feeling of betrayal, it led to some serious consequences.
What kind of consequences are we talking about?
Well, for one, it created the sense of, disillusionment. People had hoped that One PAC would be different, that they'd actually fight for them, and then they didn't.
So there's this loss of trust.
Exactly. And it contributed to this climate of fear and silence where people, maybe LGBTQ plus folks and their allies, they might have been hesitant to speak out or advocate for what they believed in.
This is sad. It's a reminder that all these political games, they have real impacts on people's lives.
Yeah, and it shows you the need for real allyship, not just empty gestures. It's about doing something, even when it's hard, even when it's risky.
So we've talked about how One PAC approached LGBTQ plus advocacy, right? And their focus on winning no matter what. But they weren't all on the same page, were they? Were there any disagreements within the group about how they were doing things?
Oh, for sure. One PAC wasn't some perfect unified front. There was definitely tension, especially when it came to how they handled inclusivity.
Okay, so give me an example.
Well, look at how Jeff Pack defended himself when people accused him of being biased against women.
How did he do that?
He pointed to all the times he had supported female candidates in the past.
So he was saying, look, I can't be biased. I've supported women before.
Exactly. And he even said he was open to hearing criticism about himself, that he was willing to reflect on his own biases.
But for a lot of people, those words felt pretty empty.
Yeah, especially when you consider what he was actually doing, how the PAC was operating as a whole. It's that whole actions speak louder than words thing.
It shows you how important it is to not just talk about being inclusive, but to actually live it out, to put it into practice.
Absolutely. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And it really raises the issue of transparency and accountability in these political groups.
If we really want a fair and equal society, we can't just talk about it.
Nope.
We have to live it, and we have to hold our leaders accountable for doing the same.
We need to see what's happening behind the scenes and understand why they're making the decisions they're making.
It's exactly. Political groups, they need to be upfront about their strategies, about what they're trying to achieve, and about the compromises they're willing to make.
It's what they owe to the people they're supposed to be representing.
And when their actions don't match up with what they say they believe in, we need to call them out on it.
Agreed.
There needs to be a system in place, like checks and balances, to make sure they're actually serving the community and not just looking out for themselves.
I like that, checks and balances. One PAC story really shows how political power can be used for good or bad.
It can be a tool for positive change, but it can also be used to shut people up and push aside those who are already struggling.
Right.
It all comes down to the choices we make, as individuals, as groups, as a community. Those choices have real consequences in the real world.
That's a powerful thought. We have a responsibility to use that power carefully and honestly. So where do we go from here? What can we in Temecula take away from all of this?
I think we need to be a lot more careful about who we support, both groups and candidates. We can't just go by slogans and fancy campaigns.
Right.
We have to look deeper at their track records, at what they've actually done.
We have to demand transparency. We need to ask tough questions. We need to hold them accountable.
And most importantly, we have to be involved. We need to vote, participate in local stuff, and make sure those in charge are actually representing us. This whole One PAC situation, it's just one part of Temecula's political story.
Yeah.
But there are some valuable lessons in there about power, about allyship, and about how important it is to stand up for what we believe in as a community.
I like that. Temecula's future isn't set in stone.
No, it isn't.
It depends on what we do, the conversations we have, and the actions we take. So let's keep learning, keep talking about this stuff, and keep digging deeper.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been talking about One PAC in Temecula and their take on inclusivity.
And as we've seen, their strategy, while maybe good at getting them political power, caused some real issues and left a lot of folks in Temecula feeling disillusioned.
So in this last part, let's talk about what One PAC's actions really mean in the long run. Like, what can we all take away from their story? What's the big lesson here?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can learn is that real allyship matters, not just the kind that looks good on the surface. It's got to be about actually doing something, not just appearances.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words, right?
Mm.
Marginalized communities need people who will truly fight for them, not just those who will support them when it's easy politically.
And that real allyship, it usually means challenging the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable or could hurt you politically. It's about standing up for what's right, even if it costs you something.
Definitely. It also means getting involved with those communities directly, listening to what they're worried about, and working together with them to create real change. It's about building that trust and showing up all the time, not just when it's convenient.
One PAC's story, it also shows how dangerous it is to make assumptions about voters. Instead of assuming that supporting LGBTQ plus rights would hurt them politically, they could have actually tested that idea.
They could have done polls, talked openly with the community, or even just had those hard conversations to understand where people were coming from.
Exactly. And because they chose not to have those conversations, they might have actually made the biases they said they were fighting against even worse.
It's like they were too scared to shake things up, and by doing that, they might have missed a chance to make a real difference.
And that leads us to another super important lesson: transparency and accountability, especially for those groups who are in politics.
Voters deserve to know how those decisions are made, what's influencing them. We need to be able to see behind the curtain and understand what's motivating their actions.
Political groups need to be upfront about how they do things, what their goals are, and what compromises they're willing to make. They owe that to the people they represent.
And if what they do doesn't match up with what they say they believe, we need to call them out.
For sure.
There needs to be some way to make sure they're really serving the community, not just themselves. One PAC's story is a reminder that political power can be used in good ways or bad ways.
Definitely. It can be a force for good, but it can also be used to silence people, especially those who are already struggling.
It all comes down to choices, doesn't it? The choices we make as people, as groups, as a community, those choices have real consequences.
We have a responsibility to use that power the right way and honestly. So what does this all mean for Temecula? What can we learn from this?
I think it means we need to be smarter about who we support, both groups and the people running for office. We got to look past the slogans and the campaigns and really see what they've done.
We need to demand that they're transparent and accountable. We need to ask them tough questions, hold their feet to the fire, and make sure they really believe in what they say they do.
And most importantly, we have to get involved. We got to vote, participate in local things, and make sure those in charge are actually representing us. This whole One PAC thing, it's just one small part of Temecula's political story.
But it teaches us some important things about power, about standing together, and about how we need to keep fighting for what we believe in as a community.
Temecula's future, it's not set in stone. It depends on what we do, the conversations we have, and the actions we take. So let's keep learning, keep talking about this, and keep digging deeper. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.